Privilege does not generate ingenuity or complexity. Privilege yields mediocrity.
Hi everyone, welcome to Art of the MOOC Conversation Series. We're here with Cannupa, Hanska Luger. Thanks, Cannupa, for being with us.
Thank you.
I thought it would be nice to start literally in the place where you were born, in Dakota. A lot of people are aware of the North Dakota pipeline protests and so on. And as an artist and someone who knows the place very deeply, you found yourself in that place, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to come up with how to use your kind of creativity in a way that would be consistent with what people were trying to accomplish, right?
The Mirror Shield project came out of the kind of engagements that were taking place at the Dakota Access Pipeline drill site. There was an encampment that was placed there called Ochetichincowi. It's right outside of the reservation I was born in, Standing Rock Reservation. And my brother actually works for the EPA for Standing Rock Reservation. So I was hearing about what was shaking out really early in this whole process, and was kind of involved. One, it's my homeland. I have family who live there, people who would be directly impacted by this pipeline. And the funny thing was that it became a hashtag. And that's significant as far as why I came to creating Mirror Shields as a response, because I was not much of a social media person. And simultaneous to this engagement, Facebook created Facebook Live. And so once Facebook Live became a part of our culture, this is when we began to see things that people have been talking about for generations, but to witness these sort of interactions take place live was something that really expanded and blew the doors off of all of these, this is how we've always done it, these methodologies that are violent but obscured by media and by presentation. Suddenly you had this social media platform that was providing to its users a platform in which to present what's happening to them right now.
There was an intense moment of international solidarity, right? Like it was very local, but also kind of
totally
global,
Totally. And that global thing really came out of this new form of recording what was happening simultaneously. Suddenly we all had body cams. So I was running supplies from New Mexico to North Dakota. I must have gone like 8 times or so. And every time I was away, I was reliant on social media to tell me what's happening at the camp. It's funny because even through that platform, you only saw 15% of what was actually happening there. And it was the 15% that triggered, and created some sort of outrage in which there needed to be action. One of those moments, I was back home, and it was just before Thanksgiving. I think it was in October. And I'm from North Dakota, so I understand how cold it is. And this was the moment at which water hoses were being used. And I was like, dude, it's not just the fact that they're spraying people with high pressure water. You need to take into consideration something that's hard to see on camera, which is it's probably 15 degrees out. And so that application of water pressure, and the use of hypothermia on a population of people who have been camping for 6 months already, 7 months already, it was violent. You compound that with percussion grenades, rubber bullets, all of these sorts of things. I was like, dude, the front line needs a shield. At that point, this big kind of push and rally around the agency that we have as far as social unrest goes and liking and sharing, I started to witness social media as what it was becoming. And I was like, it's a river that is wide and shallow. There are people liking and sharing, but what are they actually contributing? You know, I can get a gold star by putting this up on my social media feed and you know, change my picture in solidarity. But what are you actually doing? You know, my thought was I could make a video on how to create a mirrored shield and encourage people to make something. Like invest. We can't all invest money. We can't all invest resources. We can all invest time, you know? So what's your contribution? My thought was, let me go to the largest big box store, hardware store possible, one that I knew was in every single city, and let me try to make a shield out of materials from here using their resources, their tools. I was like, I'm going to show how I made this, and I'll put that out on social media and encourage people to do the same. It's a low capital impact, but a high return. The estimate was one person could make 6 shields out of a single sheet of masonite. That means one person could protect 6 people who are standing on a front line in front of, like, say, 125 people at the direct point of engagement. But then that 125 are standing in front of 12,000 people at the camps at some of its highest points. And then as people standing in defiance of the Dakota Access Pipeline, really trying to protect water. It was presented as a protest, but the original people who were there were not specifically protesting oil. They were trying to protect water. And that's a completely different dynamic. You're no longer a combatant in a protest, but you are in a position of power where you're like, I want to protect water, and I'm not protecting it just for myself, it's a river. So that's 8 million people downstream. So the idea was, this is how one person can protect 8 million people. This is, when you get to that point in your psychology where you're like, I'm just one person, what can I do? This was a design that was like, this is what one person can do.
Something that also has happened afterwards in terms of how the work gets documented and presented in our context really makes that connection clear between the individual body and the water in our, you know, in us, and how we are a river together by kind of looking at, like, on the one hand, as a protecting mechanism, it physically, you know, protects people from what's being thrown at them, shot at them, sprayed at them. But then when you turn it to the sky, it really creates a river.
Yeah.
By the color of the sky and by seeing how people together make this river, right?
I'll tell you, all of that was a disguise. I had no intention of this being an art object. It scaled in ways that I never would have comprehended. The whole intention of making it an art project was simply to get the shields to the camp. The police, there were private security firms, and there was also the National Guard, because the state declared it a state of emergency, which is usually set aside for natural disasters, but apparently my population is a natural disaster. And so that gave the state certain rights dealing with the population. So there was search and seizure at these checkpoints to get into the reservation. And so we had to, I mean, I'm driving 500 of them from Minneapolis. A friend of mine, Rory Wakeup, organized me to go do a talk in Minneapolis. And we decided, rather than doing the talk, let's get these shields to Standing Rock. So as we're driving them back, we're watching Facebook Live, we're watching people getting, like, canned food removed from them because it was deemed a weapon. Propane for cooking in these camps, deemed a weapon. And I'm like, is a shield a weapon? And that's a weird question to ask. Is a shield a weapon? And so I started to think about, what do I do with my privilege? I'm an artist. I can disguise all of this work as an art object. And that's the way that if we were to be pulled over at these checkpoints, that was the angle that I was going to present. And so the reason the shields were carried overhead is because the camps were under 24-hour surveillance. The video that you see is literally a dry run for the actual engagement, and our audience was the police surveilling us 24 hours. And so there's got to be documentation of it. I've never seen it, but we deployed, like, over 500 of those shields. The video that you've seen is about 125. I drove around in my truck and literally passed out every single shield that was at the camp to people, and we walked and meandered that river all throughout the camp. So it was a much larger presentation than what we've seen, but the audience was the police. The audience was the oppressor surveilling, you know? And I've never seen actual documentation of the actual performance.
There's other projects that you've done where people can participate, and they do, and it is an art from the very beginning, stated as such, but it also has, of course, an important social content. I'm thinking specifically of two projects that have to do with beads and people, you know, making beads and giving you beads.
Through that project, I realized that social media, although it be a river that is wide and also shallow, it's only shallow because people don't know what to do. How can I contribute? You know, liking and sharing are the only options that are available, you know, blatantly. So as artists, I was like, well, it turns out there's a way that you can encourage people to participate in art as I believe it is, which is a process. Like, how do you get people to participate in the creation of something versus just the experience of it as object in a sanctioned space? That mirror shield thing, you know, I learned what works and I learned what didn't work. And so I tried to apply that same methodology to the next project, which was everyone. What I end up doing is just making a video for social media, and it's a how-to instructional. And then it gives some place to send your contribution to. The project was around visualizing data. I was looking at data gathered in Canada around missing and murdered Indigenous women, and quickly realized that, like, there are a lot of limitations in that definition. Like, what do we consider woman? You know, if it's data, is it rounding up or rounding down? Because the number was 4,000, just a perfect number. And I'm like, a suspiciously perfect number. And I was like, there's no way that it's exactly that. So are you rounding up or are you rounding down? And if each one of those tally points as a data set is a life lost, the act of rounding is inherently dehumanizing. And data has this dehumanizing aspect to it. It's great for creating policy, but the violence that these communities have experienced is based on dehumanization. So how could dehumanization be the solution, you know? And so this idea of creating and encouraging people to make a bead for every single one of them was a way to calculate that number with some humanity in it. And that's why it's called Everyone. We got our number of beads within 2 months, and I was only using my social media platform, and at the time, it was not a huge reach. But because people were interested and people wanted to understand it better, they participated. And I think there was catharsis in it as well from the population, because letters came in with those beads that were like, one of these beads is my auntie. One of these beads is my mother. You know, one of these beads represents somebody who I've lost because of this problem, and I want to make sure that they count. That piece weighs a ton, and it's heavier than that. There's something about stewarding that work where, as that piece traveled, watching art handlers with white cotton gloves delicately remove each strand of beads and make sure that it's taken care of, was so insulting, considering that they were only a representation of real lives that nobody cared about. I struggle with it every single time, just watching how it's cared for, and I'm like, it's too late now, you know, it's too late now. Becoming steward of a symbol of a life is a lot of responsibility that when I decided to do something to hold on to, I decided not to fire the beads. And I asked people to squeeze clay in their hands, and we made beads of that, and it was another data set, and it was like over 9,000 bodies found on the US-Mexico border from one period to another. But I was like, these are people you'll never get to meet, you know? And you very well could have, and you have definitely met folks who survived that passing. These are ones you'll never get to meet. So it was something to hold on to. And we used that form as a bead to calculate the lives. I worked with Tohono O'odham Nation. I worked with two artists. One is Akamel O'odham and the other is Tohono O'odham, Marcus Breeze Thomas and Dwayne Manuel. And they made a man in the maze iteration, a labyrinth that would go across the floor. All of those hanging beads of handprints followed that maze, so it encouraged the audience to understand what a border was. Where something that they couldn't easily pass through. They were too close together, and all of their training on how to be in an art space, defied their ability to move through this labyrinth. And so they had to go amongst it and find their way back out. And after that exhibition was over, I took all of those beads and put them out into the desert. It was over 2.5 miles of beads, hand to hand. This wide, and allowed the desert to take them back, and then I was no longer, having to sit in the position of stewarding that work, but just allowed it to dissolve and be a part of the land.
And I think that may be a nice way to begin the kind of new part of our conversation, having to do with kind of your refusal to place Native and Indigenous culture in the past, right? And this idea of playing with science fiction and defying the expectations,
Future ancestral technologies is a whole another subset of my practice that is like a speculative fiction. Growing up in the United States, anytime my culture was presented both in school and then in museums, was always from like a historical context. It was like we were relics of the past. And trying to describe our contemporariness was more challenging than trying to describe our futures. Simply because there's a lot of trauma that each different nation in Indian country have experienced. It's not all the same, it varies. So when you become representative of an umbrella culture that is not real, Native American, it becomes challenging. And so what I thought would be best is to describe future, because we can't know what future is going to be. And it also encourages us to imagine ourselves beyond the trauma of our present and explore how we thrive far into the future and present that as a guaranteed narrative,
Well, and one of the titles literally takes that and says, "We survive you," right?
Yeah.
Like, we will be there in the future.
Yeah. We Survive You exists as a billboard, and it was put together with For Freedoms and NDN Collective. And that billboard is right outside of Bismarck, North Dakota, which is the primary place in which the police forces and population that was the largest aggressors against Oceti-Sakowin. So I was like, this is the perfect place to present this billboard. I have a ceramic background, and I did a lot of figurative work. And that figurative work always felt really static. It was a moment in space. But to build regalia that is worn and performed activates the fourth dimension. It's durational, it's present, it's a part of the space-time continuum. So it can radiate in every direction. It can take on the knowledge of customary practices. The figures that were in the We Survive You billboard were from a project called New Myth, and New Myth was actually based on a very old myth, which is a archetype that comes up a lot in the Americas about twin monster slayers. There's something kind of profound and a slight variant in this plurality versus the individual hero. A lot of Greek narratives that we've been taught around this myth of hero and monster is very individualized, And I'm like, man, we've never done anything alone. And if I can celebrate some of our customary stories in a future context, then we will maintain culture far into the future. And so those two figures were based on a very old story, but presented in a new way, and hopefully also stored and archived in a new form of data, you know.
You've staged these in a context that is both meaningful in terms of history, but also in terms of contemporary military industrial complexes, you know, and so on.
Yeah.
So how do you choose your settings, you know?
My primary audience is the land. And so where I do these performances are usually in close proximity to sites of extraction or sites of violence that has taken place on the land, or from the people or animals that are in proximity to that landscape. And my rationale is, we don't repair the damage we've done until we apologize for the damage we've done. These figures have taken on the responsibility of apologizing for all human-shaped things.
Intelligence is familiar. It could teach us kinship with something more than our own. We could give intelligence more agency. We make it. It is an extension of nature.
The first pieces that I made was called The One Who Checks and The One Who Balances. And they had full ceramic headpieces that removed this whole sensor array. And you literally had to feel your way across the landscape. And what was really fascinating is how it's possible to feel your way. The land became the choreographer. You had to feel your way across this landscape, and so it informed the way you moved. And if it's informing the way you move, then it is choreographing your movements. And so there's a direct relationship to land and performance.
With these ceremonies, new regalias are developed, regalias that blind us and make us deaf and prevent us from talking. They remove all the senses that we invested in as human beings and force us to feel once again, where the land itself becomes the choreographer of elaborate performances and dances in these places that need our apologies.
And how did, for example, you're collaborating with Raven Chacon, you know, and as a musician, did that happen afterwards, or did you from the beginning think, oh, I want to also think this through with you know?
Yeah. When I first met Raven was actually, we drove together up to Standing Rock when I brought all of the shields. When we first really worked together was an opera that was called Sweetland. And from that moment, we really kind of bonded, you know, stayed in the same place. It took a while to produce and present. But by the time I actually did projects with Raven, I didn't understand how difficult it was to perform in front of people. And I really don't like it. I can't shake the feeling of total objectification and me agreeing to it. And it sits with me for weeks afterwards. So my preference is to perform on the land, and if not on the land, in front of a camera. I did a project in front of a green screen. That was a step away from it, but it still felt distant. You know, my preference is probably performing on the land.
And, you know, and this is something that has come up a lot in our lectures, groups and individuals who've been subjected to high visibility, you know, as performers, you know, as what you were saying earlier, as amusement instead of, you know, meaningful ritual practice, you know.
Right.
Are resisting these histories.
It's such a challenge though, because there is an infrastructure designed to receive it as entertainment.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, but it's not though, is it? You know, and there's plenty of people who've had the same conversation and landed on the other side of that coin, where they were like, by doing this, by sacrificing myself to do this sort of work, I'm broadening the perspective, which, you know, in the future, allots future folks.
And it also has to feel right for each artist, right? So
totally.
At a deep level, you just don't feel right doing it, you know.
Yeah. And there is enough of us. I love that, you know, outside of the sense of individualism that is, you know, hard pressed into the American myth, there is also the reality that we haven't done anything alone ever, that we're hyper reliant on each other, that we are interdependent. When I realize the edge of what I'm capable of, and I'm like, I've stepped beyond my comfort zone, I find solace in the fact that I'm not alone and that there are people who can push in those boundaries.
How are you kind of now also connecting to these site-specific productions, like say Desert X. It's a natural environment to bring some of that sci-fi sensibility, right? But
totally. Desert X project, I converted my van into a fog drip system. So it's called Ghost Ride. And GHOST is an acronym for Generative Habitation Operating Systems Technology. It has this huge mesh array that goes over the front of the vehicle, and it is a condenser for fog or cloud. It condenses on the mesh, runs down the mesh, fills these ceramic vessels that are then stored, and this population moves to the next site. So they are always visiting and not extracting from the land, but how do you move through space generatively, So that was like one of the design ideas. And then I made regalia for me and my wife and my 2 boys and our dog. It has like 2 trailers on it. I put a vinyl wrap on the whole thing, so it's a mirrored vinyl. My thought was I could polish it. In the future, you might not be able to paint your car, but you could always polish it, I didn't have time to polish it. in the art space timeline. So vinyl wrap was the decision. But the interesting thing was those mirror shields used a very similar mirrored vinyl to the thing. So I'm like, it's within the language of the work,
It would be nice to kind of connect this idea of nomadic existence, to think of the buffalo and the bison, right? And how many other people have thought about this, but you've been spending a bit of time already thinking about how to make art, how to think through the decimation, the utter destruction of a whole, species that it's that as a foundation of, contemporary forms of capitalism and so on. So while these are projects that are kind of in progress, can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are, And
I have survivor's guilt. It's weird. It's weird. I've been a part of a generation that has seen bison rematriation, like bison coming back to tribal communities. Both of the reservations that I'm from have herds. I was fortunate enough to be in proximity to it growing up. So I didn't fully comprehend their absence until I started to get older and see things and understand things. And I still presently can't comprehend the scale of their population. I have no idea what 45, 60 million bison looks like in North America. But I do know that their absence has a lot to do with the claiming of the whole middle of the continent, the Great Plains. The East Coast and the West Coast have been subject to colonialism far longer than the middle of the country has. My great-grandmother lived in an earth lodge. That's not that long ago. The only way that middle of the country, the Great Plains, could be controlled and suppressed was bison had to be eliminated. And it was a war of attrition against many plains tribes, from northern plains all the way down to southern plains, but also a way to section and parcel that bit of land. So I understood and felt the weight of their absence because I come from a culture that was highly reliant and dependent on buffalo. So many of the materials we use, the cuisine and food we cooked, and what we sheltered ourselves and clothed ourselves in was related to that. And my whole experience was growing up without access to any of that preparation knowledge because the animal was missing from our ecological network. Once again, like with the land, we need to understand the depth of that absence, and we need to figure out a way to start with an apology to it. And so a lot of my work really lands on allowing people to comprehend the devastation of its absence, because it's been absent for so long that we find this normal, And I think it's weird. I think this is weird. And so how do we present that? How do we inform a population? And how do you allow the buffalo to reemerge in the history of America, because it's entangled in even the development of this country and this nation.
Something that has been really interesting for me to observe is how, with a very successful studio practice, you've really learned how to take the museum space and do very different things with it. So right now you have, I don't know how many exhibitions up, at the same time, and each one of them is a succinct kind of body of work. So as a maker who's often had to make these things in your studio, right?
Yeah.
It makes sense to make a body of work at a time,
Totally.
But I feel like there's more to it too, because it kind of helps the audience understand like a set of meanings.
I am a terrible multitasker, but I'm also like ADD. If I work in a series, I can have multiple of the same thing happening at the same time. So as I'm getting distracted from doing one thing and moving to the next, it's all working towards a cohesive body. Because I'm making a lot of these materials at the same time, I'm also getting better. Like that's the unique surprise of being a maker in your studio. If I'm building everything myself, and why I'll jump around from one thing to the next is, I might accidentally have come up with a technique that I was applying to one that I now want to apply to all of them. It's a blessing, in that sense. But I'm pretty material agnostic, I love clay. I think it's a wonderful material, but I also like applying it to different materials or using different materials with it and just kind of like compounding all of this stuff. I love using found material, and primarily where I go looking is byproducts of some sort of industry. Like, what is a remnant of a process that suddenly is a material that I could have in bulk, but is also free, or relatively inexpensive. And then I have to figure out how to use it, And so that's always really exciting to me. I like material. The material goes a long way for telling a story. Because I work in all of these different materials, one thing I never struggle with is ideas. Moving from one material to the next, one idea to the next, I'm never exhausted by reproducing the same stuff. And because I'm working with all these different materials and forms, I have a lot of weird skill sets, And so it's always fun to like come back and consider how they would proliferate and become something else. With Speechless, I was really exploring my relationship to institutions, museums, the academy, any sort of space that beckons for your perspective and applies zero of your effort. I'm like, wow, you literally just hired me to come here and present a whole thing. You asked, how can we change? How can we do something different? And when I provide viable alternatives, ways to think differently, I haven't seen it applied at an institutional level. And so I'm like, wow, feels like I'm a giant speaker that makes no sound. Or at least if no one's listening, is it making sound? And so there is a motif throughout Speechless that is a teeth biting its tongue. Bite your tongue, and to present it in a format that is familiar, the speaker stack, it's like, I'm a 80s, 90s kid, like speaker stacks where, you could get stickers, you can get skateboards, you saw it. But I also thought about it as a drum, like a speaker's a drum. A drum is a way to call for reverie, in one way or another. And so even the secular world of a rave is a ceremonial call to collective dance and vibe. I'm like, I don't see the difference in them. And so I wanted to look at speakers and really move it through cargo cults. I want to look at a speaker, break apart all of the parts and apply indigenous kind of perspectives on it. So all the cones are made out of ceramic. They're all daisy chained with braids, hair braids. And I was like, hair's power. So let's daisy chain this thing together in that form. And then by creating this whole landscape of cargo cult-like speakers, I considered it an opportunity for us to look at ourselves. I'm of the opinion that cargo cult was probably the religion that is most successful in the 21st century. And I say that because Bezos, because Musk's, because those who provide cargo are the wealthiest people on the planet. And we worship at those tables, we sacrifice, we offer blood of others in order to receive those things. So I'm like, whose technology is archaic,